everyone, I'm Kaylin Johnson, and today I'm going to talk to you about knitting charts and how they relate to the cultural visual theory of semiotics. I imagine most of you are familiar with the activity of knitting, but just to recap, knitting is a type of fiber art involving yarn and two needles. You can knit sweaters, scarves, gloves, and most other things made of fabric. Knitting is a loop-based fiber art, as opposed to crochet, which is not based. So it tends to be very soft and malleable, but it doesn't hold a lot of structure. Each loop in a knitted cloth is a stitch, and there are several types of stitches. Okay, so what are knitting charts? Knitting charts are a type of knitting pattern that knitters use to create certain designs, especially textural designs. Knitting charts can stand on their own, or they can be included within a pattern to demonstrate a certain panel or the overall pattern. Knitting charts include a grid with vertical and horizontal lines. They also include numbering down the sides and often on the top and bottom. Finally, they include small images in some of the grid squares. There is almost always a key to help users interpret those images. In semiotic theory, the study of signs, there are approximately 3 ways to classify images. These ways are based on the relationship between the representation, the signifier, and the thing being represented, the signified. One classification is the symbol, which relates to what it represents in a learned way. The representation has no similarity or relation to what is being represented besides the cultural. Another classification is the index, which depicts something that is related in some way to the thing being represented, but isn't exactly that thing. Finally, there are icons, which directly depict the thing being represented. Knitting charts are iconic. They directly represent the corresponding piece of cloth that they provide the instructions to create. Each square represents a stitch, and the full grid represents either an entire piece of cloth or a finished pattern within a piece of cloth, and it shows a strong resemblance, particularly to the knitter's eye. Less obviously iconic are the smaller images within the chart. Although these images are not necessarily consistent across charts, they are often similar, and almost always look like a very simplified version of the stitch they represent. For instance, this is a knitting chart for the front panel of a sweater I'm working on. It has 7 different types of stitches: knit, purl, and then 5 types of cables. You'll notice that the cable symbols extend over multiple squares. This is because they involve multiple individual stitches. The knit stitch and the purl stitch are represented by a blank square and a dot, respectively. This seems counterintuitive, but if you take into account the loop structure, it makes perfect sense. The front of the knit stitch slides smoothly into the stitch before it, leaving a smooth, almost blank texture, while the front of a purl stitch leaves a bump. So, the smooth purl stitch is represented as a blank, and the bumpy purl stitch is represented as a dot. It makes sense that these symbols are iconic. Ferreira et al. 2005, in investigating user interface design, found that redesigns of computer symbols, colloquially referred to as icons, but that's a bit confusing when we're talking about semiotics, typically tended towards making them more iconic. The authors explain this change by suggesting that users expect symbols that correlate with doing something to look like the thing that is being done. And that has perfect relevance to knitting, because the image, both overall and the smaller images within, look like what will be done overall. It is easier for knitters with the requisite knowledge to interpret them quickly and easily. The iconic nature of the images makes them more usable for crafters who have the cultural and technical knowledge to interpret them. That said, the knitting chart may be incomprehensible by non-knitters because it does require that cultural and technical knowledge. It is an almost wordless form of instruction which often requires explanation for young knitters. One particularly confusing aspect of knitting charts is the necessity for them to be read in a back and forth pattern starting from the bottom right, which is unconventional for English readers. It may also be difficult for outsiders to recognize the depiction as iconic, since that knowledge depends a lot on knowing how individual stitches look, which makes them difficult to read for inexperienced knitters. Overall, the knitting chart is a remarkable instruction tool in the knitting community that relies on its iconic nature to be so effective. Thanks for watching.